Welcome to a true spiritual adventure story like the world has never known, with your host, Dr. James Yogadhi Weldon. Good day. This is Dr. Jim Weldon speaking from Heavenly Mountain in Boone, North Carolina. Our community, which is dedicated to bridging the gaps in our understanding between the different traditions of the world and showing the underlying truth behind all of these traditions. Today we'll be continuing in our ongoing episodes and story, and actually a true spiritual adventure novel, surprising as it may seem, entitled The Story Behind the Greatest Story Ever Told, Memories from the Life of Jesus. In order to understand how such a thing might be possible, I encourage you, obviously, to listen to some of the earlier stories. Essentially, many years back, in a state of consciousness called Turiya, beyond my control, prior from waking in the morning, I began to see the events of the life of Jesus, just like walking through a 3D movie. And after a few days of this, I started writing some notes, and I decided I probably should start writing this down. And it continued for some time, and it's continuing even to this day, more than a decade later. At this point in the story, the child Jesus has traveled to India, been trained for almost 2 decades in India, spending the first 12 years or so in a school down in what is called the Chennai region. And he was sponsored by a yogi, a spiritual teacher, inspired by his spiritual teacher, which sent the 3 wise men to his family in the early days of his life. So I encourage you to review those episodes so you can understand what I'm talking about. And at this point in the story, the young Master Jesus is beginning his trek back to his home, traveling the caravan routes, which his father took those caravan routes, at least part of the way to India. And he's decided now in his 30s to begin to make that trek back home. He is driven by a desire to alleviate some of the suffering, meet his family after many years, and try to tell the story of some of the things that he's passed through. Now, at this time in the story, there is a continuing disturbance that's going on and restlessness in the Jewish community. Although they were allowed to practice their rites without interference, the heavy hand of the Romans continues, particularly when it comes to paying the duties, the taxes that are due. Pontius Pilate is now basically operating that entire region through his 3 sons, who are not kings, but act like kings. And administrators who run the different regions really have the power. But life continues to be extremely precarious. At any time, they could enter a home, ransack the home, look for evidence. You were guilty until proven innocent, especially if the claim was being made by somebody of a high rank. And so the entire Jewish community, although they had quite a bit of freedom compared to some of the other countries and regions that were conquered, they continue to yearn for freedom. And that freedom was very practical, just to do their work, raise their family, practice their religious rituals, and continue to live a life without interference. They were mostly allowed to do this as long as one lived one's life within the boundaries set by the Roman leaders and the tribunals that could judge a person in very short order. And so in this environment, Some opponents were there, as they always would be. And many of these opponents operated in some of the remote areas in the desert. And one of these was the individual that came to be known as John the Baptist. Now, he had a spiritual history and a backstory, just like we all have a backstory. We didn't come from nowhere. We don't go to nowhere. Life is quite big. And the Jewish community was always looking for some inspiration carefully from within their community. And John the Baptist was one of these individuals, which gradually was rising to an area of respectability. He was in and connected with these communities that were in the remoter areas. So if you lived in an area which was far away from the control of Rome, you had more freedom. And these religious communities sought to weave a life around this. And John was one of these who lived in the remote areas and practiced fasting and penance and solitude. You know, it's interesting that when I was in that part of the world, I looked out into some of these regions. Of course, now, 2019, it's much more built up, obviously. But there were sinners that were completely beyond the control of the Romans. And those that were seeking a deeper life would go into these communities. But at this time, it was quite an austere lifestyle. Now, John the Baptist had intuitive capabilities. He was a wise soul. Some thought that he was Elijah come again. Of course, they said that of Jesus as well. And it might surprise you to know that during the time of Jesus' trials and tribulations, in the time that he actually spent there, it was a very short time that he spent there. That the entire story that later became the basis of the scriptures of Jesus, less than 1 year. We don't know the other parts of his life. And of course, this is what I am sharing here in these works to those that are open-minded about the possibility of knowing things directly. John the Baptist was one of these individuals that had this intuitive knowledge. And he felt that there needed to be a change. There was a need for us to turn away from the worldliness and do good. Try to make a difference. Live according to the tenets of righteousness. And so he would come into the communities from time to time and speak about what he felt was a coming change. And he predicted and was predicting during these times of a coming of a great teacher, a great presence, because that presence had touched his life as well. You see, we are all connected. We're all linked. Very much like all the different cells in your hand are connected to your body, but very few of those cells have an awareness of you, but still they do the bidding. So in his period of silence, the inspirational insight would rise in his mind, and he would see scenes and events that were taking place at a distance. So imagine John the Baptist being in his quiet place, in his retreat, living very simply, but yet his mind and awareness was able to rise up and sense the stress and the distress of the Jewish people. And so because of his love, he hoped to make a difference. And one of the ways that he did that was through a very simple rite of baptism. So that rite could be thought of immersing oneself in the waters of the Jordan or being blessed by water. And really that's symbolic of immersing ourselves, our mind, in the greater being within us. And only through that immersion could we be cleansed and take up a new way of being, a more loving, a more kind, a more righteous way of being. Now, there were many in that community that saw him as a firebrand because obviously, when anyone spoke of opposition because of the Roman oppression and the oppression of the rulers, really, of that community as well, and extracting payments, taxes, it was the hope that that wouldn't be necessary. And the thought was, why should we support these armies that are not even protecting us to fight in other wars, to some place and some land and some society that is not part of our society? So there were firebrands and other individuals which spoke of revolt. John the Baptist was more that the change needed to come within first. And so his very simple rite of baptism was to wash away our sadness, our unhappiness, letting go of the past. You know, in the context of all of this, life does repeat itself. And in terms of us coming again and again to learn the lessons of life. But even in terms of groups of individuals that work together for a higher cause of spirituality can be relived in a better way. And so that John the Baptist came in with a very simple teaching, and that was immerse yourself in the new way, prepare yourself for a new coming, a new rising of the spirit of the life. And of course, people would encourage this and think of this as revolting against the Romans. Obviously, he would be happy if the yoke could be thrown off. But in practicality, he understood that that could take some time. So at the very least, surrender yourself to the waters of life, to the cleansing and the purification of silence, of fasting, of prayer, to purify yourself for the coming of the divine, the Lord. And that divine is much greater than me. He said, what is coming is much, much greater. You see, John the Baptist had also known Jesus in an early time, in an earlier life. John the Baptist also was a student in an earlier time of one of these great spiritual teachers, of the great being that was going to manifest through the life of Jesus when he is christened. He didn't know that consciously, but he felt more and more that the time was imminent. Make haste, make right your way, cleanse your heart and your mind, live a righteous, good life, care for your family and responsibilities, but don't ignore the deeper truth of your connection to that. So when the immersion happened into the water, there was an effect. There was a real spiritual power that he had, a blessing that John the Baptist had. And you might be surprised that he actually had a much bigger following, even after Jesus had been there. Of course, he is killed because of his opposition to Pontius Pilate taking a new wife, divorcing and taking a new one. That wasn't correct, according to his beliefs. So that opposition actually angered that family. So he angered that family, particularly the wife. And so that is why he was ultimately killed, not because of his teaching, but because he refused to not speak about those lives that were being lived. So he was a holy man. He was an authentic teacher, and he felt the coming of the Lord. He felt that there would be a presence. Exactly how that would happen, he didn't know exactly. And so the stage was being set. Actually, a number of individuals had been born and in this area play a part. And they'd played a part in the past. And although very, very few people know, they will play a part in future times as well to try to make a difference in the world, try to raise the world's awareness and love. And don't be surprised if some of them are here in the present as well. So something to think about. Bless yourself in the waters of life. Purify yourself from those deadly thoughts and actions and the hate and the anger and the frustration, so that you too may be filled with a new life and bring into this world more love and make a difference. So join us again. We'll be talking about the trek back to his land of Israel. Really, at this point, he's already en route, and John the Baptist is feeling the quickening of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, which is the same life in all of us. But the vibrations of that were coming up, and the insight, he had that insight that something very powerful was going to happen. In our next episode from this amazing story and the story behind the story. It's impossible for us to understand the life of Jesus and the purpose of his life without knowing the fuller story of his life. You can't know the whole body by looking at a single finger. You can't do it. It just can't be done. You have to see the entire being to know a person, who they are, what they're for. This is Dr. Jim Weldon speaking from our wonderful community here, which is dedicated to bridging the gaps. If you want to help verify this, true or not true, I would encourage you actually to listen then to some of my earlier works, Living the Enlightened Life, the second book. A global phenomenon is taking place in our times. So join us again, and we'll share more of this story. As it comes to me, I'll share it with you. So long.